Okay. All right, so I've said it a few times already, but this is the official welcome. My name is Leslie Gross-Wertzen, and I'm a postdoctoral associate here at the Council on African Studies, and I'm really excited to be convening this discussion with Dr. Kamari Clarke, along with help from our invisible but essential coordinators, Program Director for African and Middle East Studies, Kristen Siebert, and Program Coordinator for the Council on African Studies, Nora Langet. And they'll be, they've done a lot of the behind the scenes work, and will also be helping moderate the Q&A and just make sure everything runs smoothly. And I want to also thank the Council on African Studies Chair Michael Capello and the Macmillan Center, as well as Anne Underhill and the Anthropology Department, for their support in inviting Dr. Clarke to be with us today. And it's especially poignant to have her here to speak at a joint Anthropology Council on African Studies talk, given that she was herself at Yale in the Anthropology Department from 1999 to 2013, and also was a chairperson of the Council on African Studies from 2009 to 2012. So it feels like a wonderful, circle, right? And really fitting. So before we begin, even as we are convening in this virtual space, I think it's important to recognize that some of us, including myself, are settlers on unceded or unfairly ceded land. And in my case, the lands and waterways that constitute New Haven and the state of Connecticut were traditionally stewarded by the Quinnipiac, Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Niantic, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples. And also, for those of us who are maybe outside of the United States and aren't following US national news, today is the third day of the murder trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer that killed George Floyd. So I'm mindful of how this is unfolding and is present to us even as we discuss the rule of law, the circulation of affects that give certain discourses and practices of justice and injustice their force, and how in the as we are talking about the African context, these discussions are often displaced as something that is only unresolved over there, but are actually central to the operations of power and racial violence in the United States until the present. So I want to give us a sense of the structure of this discussion before I introduce Dr. Clarke. We'll start out with about a 25-minute discussion of her book and some of the other work she's been doing, especially in terms of her work in theorizing the need for radical humanism in anthropology and more broadly in Western universities. And I anticipate the way that this conversation will go is just to give us a taste or a sampling of Dr. Clarke's contributions across multiple disciplines. And so we'll allot the second half of the hour for your comments and your questions. So, as your questions come up or your comments come up, feel free to register those in the Q&A. And then at, about the 12:30, 12:35 mark, we'll start working through as many of those as possible. And I just want to remind everyone in this space that as much as possible, try to put your questions into sort of everyday language so that they're clear for all of us. I think one of the wonderful things about gathering virtually is that we have attendees from all over the world and also across disciplines and professions even. So I want to make sure that we're able to offer accessible speech and encourage maximum participation in the conversation. So that's all sort of the introductory part. And now I want to tell you a little bit about our esteemed guest today. So Dr. Clarke is a distinguished professor at the University of Toronto, and she's currently on leave from the Anthropology Department at the University of California in Los Angeles. Her research intervenes in discussions related to legal institutions, international legal domains, religious nationalism, and the politics of globalization and race. And actually I could have kept that going for 3 more lines, but I'll stop there. She's published in more than 50 peer-reviewed journals, including the Annual Review of Anthropology, Cultural Anthropology, the International Journal of Human Rights, the African Journal of Legal Studies, and one of my favorites, Small Acts, among many others. And she's also the author of multiple books, most recently 2 on the International Criminal Court, Fictions of Justice, and her most recent one in the focus of our discussion today, Affective Justice, the International Criminal Court and the Pan-African Pushback, which was published in 2019 by Duke University Press. Support their unionization effort, all. Affective Justice was awarded the Royal Anthropological Institute's Amory Talbot Book Prize, which is just really the most recent of her many teaching and research awards. I personally came to know Dr. Clarke's work through the 2006 book she co-edited with Deborah Thomas, Globalization and Race, which brought a comparative and empirically grounded framework for thinking about how racialized difference is produced in post-colonial contexts, and has been really instrumental in informing my work. So Kamari, thank you so much for being here. And I just wanted to start like right at the beginning by asking or inviting you to tell us about your latest book, Affective Justice, and maybe also what brought you to to this particular project, especially given that you've been writing about the International Criminal Court. Like, what led you to consider the role of feelings in the context of international law?
Great, thank you. I'd like to just start by thanking the Council on African Studies and the Yale Anthropology Department, of course, for the invitation to discuss affective justice, and also to Nora Langut and Kristen Cyber for so competently arranging things and reminding me, poking me via email when my responses weren't as quickly forthcoming as they needed to be. And of course, to Leslie Gross-Ritz for the invitation to join you today. I should also say that the affective justice actually grew out of a significant amount of the research that I did while I was at Yale in the first decade of the 21st century in many ways, and it gained significant input and influence by my engagement with people like Marcia Inhorn, Sean Brotherton at the time, who was there, and our late colleague Barney Bate. So it's really wonderful to be returning to talk about this work, since in many ways the questions that emerged and the preliminary thinking was baked in the context of Yale and New Haven. So what brought me to this work is the first question, and I'll start with just a description and a feeling, and then map out, I guess, very briefly, the point of departure for this work. And in a visceral sense, when, from 2000 to about 2009, when I was writing fictions of justice, I was going to the UN preparatory commission meetings for the making of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And over time, it was becoming clearer that the first indictments were going to be indictments of African leaders, African warlords, Africans in general, and the victims before the court were Black Africans for the most part. And as one Black African after another was indicted by the court, and the cases started to unfold, what struck me was the lack of vocabulary and depth in the scholarship for thinking through the politics of race and its relationship to legal anthropological questions and international justice questions writ large. So how do we make sense of a researcher's gut response in which it's very difficult to figure out what gives the court its force, and how it can be that in a moment when the US is waging war in Iraq and Afghanistan, there are no possible indictments there, but instead there are indictments on the continent. And in many ways, that sort of the gut response and the will to know and to understand analytically the conditions in which this is possible led me to this work. And so but in scholarly terms, notions of justice, because the larger optic, of course, was then how do we think about this as justice? What makes this justice? And how does a court that doesn't have the privilege of sovereignty of a state, that doesn't have a police force of its own, that doesn't have the mechanisms that a state often enjoys, the absolute use of force, etc. How does such an institution gain legitimacy was one of the earlier questions. And when the politics of racialized victimhood and the indictment of just Black Africans are part of the fabric of justice, international justice writ large, how do we understand the power and how convincing this can and cannot be? And so that, in many ways, led me to think about justice in a more pragmatic way, beyond the fictions of justice and the ways that I framed that work, by ultimately saying that justice is what you say it is, or that there's an impossibility around what justice is. In part, affective justice was actually an attempt to show how the production of justice works within a particular assemblage, and how race and racialization is key to thinking about the assemblage through which it works. And so notions of justice historically have been understood through three broad categories. So often it's philosophical, analytic, and practice-oriented. And of course, the philosophical and the analytic, certainly in the philosophical domain, Derrida, John Rawls, there's a whole slew of scholars, philosophy, political science, etc., who have looked at questions of justice and fairness. And the same for the analytics around justice: what is morally right, what is fair, what is ethical. But the intervention that emerges with affective justice has to do with the politics of practice. So when we understand justice as a domain of practice, justice as being produced and as being challenged by the materiality of people's actions, what does that look like, and how does that play out in this international justice sphere, in which there's an international court that doesn't have the privileges of a state and the kind of power and the mechanisms that a state would? And so, so really what led me to this is really an inquiry into what anthropology has to say about this practice-oriented meaning making. How do we understand notions of appropriateness? How do they emerge? What are the conditions for the possible, and thinking through sociocultural behavior in making sense of these practices? And what certainly emerged was, for me, an attempt to think about these emotional responses, the embodied sets of practices, but beyond the embodied sets of practices, the emotional regimes that orient, that structure the kinds of practices that get to be seen as legitimate, the kind of histories that make possible these justice utterances. And then the third is the space of the technocratic. I was interested in how through lawmaking and how through biopolitical terrain, through technocratic knowledge production, we actually see the concretization of practices, the putting in place of treaties and laws that actually enable the conditions of the possible. And so those three dynamics really, for me, over the course of this writing, came together as key for thinking about the place of emotion, that it's not simply this fluff that exists over there, but actually we're talking about forms of regimentation that are aligned with technocratic knowledge, legal force, that are aligned with racial regimes that shape the viability of particular responses, and then the politics of the embodied response. And those three really are central to the workings of affective justice. And I'll just say one other in responding to that question. Some of you who haven't read the book might ask, well, what is affective justice then? You know, you had some ideas around writing it, but what is it actually? And what I show in the book is that it's actually a term that I advance for understanding people's conceptions of justice or experiences of justice through embodied and always contingent and contested practices. So it's not simply that justice doesn't exist or that justice is deeply subjective, but that justice is produced, it's embodied, and it's always contingent and contested. So someone can say in a given moment that they feel a certain way and they're having a particular response, and next week it's a very different response and a very different set of alliances around what justice is. And often there are patterns you know, it's not simply and always a matter of disarray and inconsistency, but sometimes yes, and time and place is relevant in thinking about how affective justice works. And so the key component parts, and I'll just quickly show an image because I think this might help to concretize what the book promotes or suggests. That if you look at the large rubric, so these three component parts, legal technocratic practices, embodied affects, and emotional regimes, are really the key components of this practice-oriented justice making that is manifest in the international rule of law. And so really the book and the attempt that's embedded in the book really is to think through how this plays out and how those pieces are messily and rhizomatically coming together to shape what comes to constitute justice and people's sense of the legitimacy of justice in these terrains. And this is how it plays out in international legal, in this particular international justice regime. But certainly there are a range of other spaces in which we can apply this conceptualization to think about how those things play out. And I was particularly interested in emotional regimes. So, so when I was in the courtroom observing the actors at play, what were the regimes that shaped how I thought and what I felt, or the order of things that constituted my response to the various things that I saw and heard, and vice versa, not just me as the researcher, but others as well. And so the book looks at these paradoxes and how these regimes in many ways offers an answer and explains how it is that, you know, a given country like Kenya could vote in an indictee, an indicted man who became president of the country during that period, despite the fact that he was indicted by the International Criminal Court. And so I look to these questions of the workings of emotional regimes, thinking about embodied affects, and of course, the technocratic questions that are both historical and political that come to play. So Leslie, hopefully that's enough for answering that question. You can certainly follow up if, you know, there's so much more, but that should be a start.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. One thing I really like about this model and, you know, drawing on assemblage theory is that you get a lot more traction into kind of the multiple components that structure, you know, international law beyond what you call the black letter law. But it also, I think, destabilizes sort of a binary, right, in terms of like one notion of justice versus another, and they're completely in contrast, but shows how their particular notions of justice are, you know, enacted or produced, you know, within the assemblage, and how there's struggle and contest even within that. And so I thought that was really interesting and helpful. And actually, I thought maybe just to, you know, you mentioned Kenya, and so to bring it through to one of the case studies that you look at in your book, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Kenyan case, you know, and what it helps us understand about this idea of affective justice. And particularly, you know, you talk about the indictment of Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto in 2012 by the ICC. And so I was just wondering if you could say, you know, what happened there, maybe, you know, talk a little bit about the election violence that led up to this indictment, and then how they mobilized sort of a counter narrative, and they mobilized these emotional regimes for a different justice claim, maybe is the best way that I can think to say that.
Yeah, thanks for that. Certainly, in many ways, the book looks at three constituted units. One of them is anti-impunity activists who are pushing for the implementation of the rule of law. There's the Pan-Africanist pushback, often, looking at elite leaders for the most part who are mobilizing constituencies to support them. And then there's this concept of the international community. And so in thinking about the Kenyan context, it's these post-colonial elite. In the case of Kenyatta, certainly it's quite powerful. So there are a couple of chapters in the book where I talk about the vehement, the profound mobilization of historical support around Uhuru's father, Jomo Kenyatta. But on the slide, what you see is so the figure of the victim to be saved. This is the Boko Haram, the young girls who were abducted by Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. There's the figure of the perpetrator, often in militia, evil looking, brown skin, dark skin, etc. And then there's the international community, as we see here through the Bring Back Our Girls. And often what emerges is this dyad that's produced as a way to constitute and make sense of whose side one is on, right? In the ways that the play of power takes shape. So in relation to the dyad that's connected to structural inequality and the deployment in the Kenyan case. Of course, what we saw in Kenya 2002, 2007, 2008 was the murder of over 1,000 people, the homelessness, many people harmed from that violence, and it was related to electoral violence. And the sense that it was an unjust election. We've seen this before, of course, for the Americans that are in the room, the refusal to accept the results and the resort to violence is the only way to address what was seen as inequality and unfair politics. And of course, this led to the ICC taking this case, and there were 6 people who were named or indicted and for whom arrest warrants were released. And one of them was Uhuru Kenyatta, the son of Jomo Kenyatta. Now, the point here I use Jomo Kenyatta, Jomo and Uhuru Kenyatta as examples of the play of emotion in the mobilization of political support, because at the time, of course, Kenyatta wasn't the president at all, and William Ruto wasn't the deputy president. But despite their indictment, Kenyan people voted for them and they became leaders, and they made it very difficult for the International Court, the International Criminal Court, to get the evidence that they needed. In fact, there were claims of witness tampering and subsequent deaths that were seen, that were alleged to be connected to that. But what's interesting in the context of effective justice is the resort to colonial violence and structural violence, and it's not unreasonable to make that connection, that the land, 100 years prior, the politics of land continues to haunt Kenyan contemporary politics. When the British took the best land, and it resulted in people being destabilized and rendered refugees from their own land. And much of the politics at play, of course, really do go back to that period. And so when people say Kenyatta is not responsible for this violence, it's the colonials that are responsible. They did this. Kenyatta was only defending us. He was supporting us. What in part they're saying is that there's a recognition that there's a deep-seated temporality here, and that the ICC's jurisdiction might start in 2007, 2008 in a narrowly construed period, but it doesn't deal with the structural violence that is a century old. It doesn't allow us to point to structural injustice that existed, and there was never compensation for that as part of the sentiment. And so in the book, then I attempt to think through how that plays out through the modalities that I showed earlier. And there are two concepts that emerge in the book. One is legal encapsulation, and the other is affective retribution. And legal encapsulation is the encapsulation of the notion of justice and the alignment of it with the law, so that justice comes to be the law. And we see this a lot in pro-ICC, the anti-impunity movement, where the prosecutor says, this is not about politics, this is about law, this is about blind law. And instead, affective retribution is the way that I conceptualize the pushback, the Pan-Africanist pushback, which is this kind of encapsulation of justice is not acceptable. And what people actually do is that they reattribute culpability. They reattribute it in relation to time and place. They reattribute it in relation to the particular figures. In the case of Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta, the reattribution back to his father, as we see in the image of Jomo Kenyatta at the bottom right. Jomo Kenyatta was the independence figure. He was imprisoned. There was a court case. It was seen as a sham trial by the British, where he was arrested and made to serve time in prison. But actually, he was a political prisoner. He was a revolutionary. And there was a demand for his release, he finally was released and negotiated the settlement for independence for the country. And so when Uhuru Kenyatta says, he just shakes his head and says, we've seen this before. He doesn't even need to spell it all out. His constituency knows exactly what that means. And he's mapping on incongruent things that are also congruent, in the sense that the British colonial court versus the International Criminal Court are actually structurally different, but also structurally similar and perceived as such. And so that example makes its way in the book as a way to think through this affective retribution. There are no number of other examples of affective retribution, but that's the main one that I think, Leslie, that's at least the one that you latched onto and thought was interesting to talk about.
Yeah, that's great. You know, as I was reading that, and let me take a second and just invite the attendees now to be registering your questions, because we're going to turn to that in just a minute. But I just wanted to say that, you know, as I was reading your book, and you talk about Kenyatta giving a speech and gesturing to this colonial violence, like very subtly in some ways, but you could feel the energy, the feelings in your body and in the crowd's body, you know, that the people described it, you know, viscerally, like experiencing it as he did that, and the way that, yeah, that these embodied affects get mobilized in that particular way and have so much force. Anyway, as I was reading that part, I just could not help thinking about the last 4 years in the United States and the ways in which I feel like feelings have, if not moved to the center of, I don't know, the practice of politics and political claims and claims about justice and truth, in the United States and elsewhere, at least we're more aware of the role that they play. And just while I'm, you know, inviting people to ask other questions, I wanted to see if you had a response to that, or how you think about other contexts in which affective justice is, you know, is really salient today.
Yeah, great. Sure, I'm happy to think about that, and I've been thinking about that a lot of late with the recent elections, federal elections. But in relation to the ICC, why don't I start by responding there, because it's quite rich and profound, because it does speak to what the Pan-Africanist elite are claiming to be double standards. And so, of course, you have 25 odd indictments, all of Black and brown Africans. And now, of course, there are investigations in Afghanistan and possibly in Palestine and Israel. But the reality when we think about the war in Afghanistan, or we think about the violence in other places, it's worth trying to make sense of what the assemblage is that's at play, what is operating, what are the mechanisms through which this is happening, the affective regimes, how do these juridical domains work, and what does anthropology have to say about the workings of these macro and meso and micro politics. And this is one of the hardest things. So if we move from the kind of ethnographic techniques of mapping this in an African context and think about what's happening in the US, what we have, of course, is a context in which, like in Sudan, the ICC is not a state party. I mean, the US is not a state party to the Rome Statute. So they signed it, but they unsigned it. Under Clinton, they unsigned it under Bush. It was never ratified. And under Trump, it was absolutely dismissed and aggressively fought. And what's interesting is the language that is used and the invocations that are raised. So when Pompeo was Secretary of State, he said, and I'll quote, "This is truly a breathtaking action by an unaccountable political institution masquerading as a legal body." So this was a response that he had to the Afghanistan investigation. So the lead prosecutor pursuing an investigation into the US's role in violence in Afghanistan. Pompeo saying things like, the ICC is a thoroughly broken and corrupt institution. He goes on, he threatens to take all necessary measures to, as he says, protect our citizens from this renegade so-called court. Trump's personal attorney saying we have to protect US troops from the threat of accountability before the ICC. And this Sekulow tweeted when he was at The Hague at the time, pursuing this line, he tweeted, "Our heroes are being attacked, not with weapons, but with threats of legal action from a body with no jurisdiction over them." And then they end, a US-based NGO, in responding to this tweet, then asserts this point: the prosecutor essentially wants the authority to treat the United States like the Taliban. So often in US context, the legitimacy, a kangaroo court, we also saw that language, broken and corrupt institution, so-called court. And then we see the discourse of protecting the troops from the ICC, and that the troops are being attacked. And so we could think about the conditions of the possible in making sense of how this emerges, what this means in US context, what are the emotional regimes, what does it play on, what does it mean to feel that you have to stand in solidarity with the troops by an illegitimate force, and then what does it mean to liken it to the US, to the Taliban, that there's a parallelism here. So yeah, the application, we can use it in so many ways to show how these emotional regimes actually take shape, what the embodied feeling is when we talk about our troops. How are we to feel? Are we not to feel angry? What is the bodily response to that? And how does it relate to the emotional regimes? And how is that fundamentally connected to the kind of technocratic practices that actually have shielded the US from accountability by the court? So yeah, hopefully, Leslie, that answers that question.
Absolutely. And we have a few questions I want to move to, but just to say that this ourness, this, like, I don't know, temporary kinship or constituting some sort of community, you talk about that in terms of this Bring Our Girls Back in Nigeria as well. And the power, the power that has is really fascinating. And also the like racial subtext feels like the wrong word, right? But like the racializing logics that obtain in all of these situations, like differently, but presently, I think, across them. But let me move now to the questions. So the first one is from Yannick Joseph, and is that right? Yeah, okay. And the question is, asking you to please comment on the violent conflict currently in Ethiopia between armed groups, which were previously liberation movements. So in Eritrea, Tigray, etc. So this is, stuff that's unfolding in the moment. And maybe, do you want more than one question?
Yeah, sure.
Actually, maybe that might be helpful because they might even fit together. So the next attendee thanks you for the wonderful book and presentation. And they were looking at your slide of this picture of the victim perpetrator dyad that's, relevant in international law, and wondering how gender plays a role in producing effective justice.
Okay, good. I'll take both of them, and I'll be mindful of the time as well. So yes, the conflict in Ethiopia is very difficult and longstanding. And, one of the, in relation to international criminal law and jurisdiction, the big question is whether or not, what does it mean that Ethiopia is outside of the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction, and what are the alternate mechanisms that the AU and other bodies can take? What political actions are possible? And actually, this is it's an excellent example of the call on the political, the need for political solutions to age-old questions, boundary questions in this case, and it's. I think the more that we can bracket or provincialize international legal solutions, the better that they are. And the more that we can look at political responses to such structural problems, the better it is. That it's not simply a matter of who is culpable within which temporal period or temporal jurisdiction, but instead, what are the structures of power and inequality that give rise to such violence, and what are the ways that states are responding to what was revolutionary actions and demonizing and making them seem as they're again another extension of a Taliban. And we see that playing out, of course, by Ethiopian forces. So that's a difficult one, but I think there we need political solutions, not legal solutions. In relation to the other question about gender, yes, absolutely. Let me just go to the slide. Yeah, so the image, let me just turn to it again. I'm going to share screen since I'm going to respond to that. So this is the image that you're asking about. And this is there because on the left-hand side, the young girl, this is the Boko Haram situation. At the time, it wasn't under scrutiny by the ICC, but has since been taken up as part of the investigation. And part of what affective justice seeks to do is actually to think about the racialized, gendered politics of the category of the victim. Much of legal anthropology and international justice scholarship isn't as concerned with these racialized regimes, how they play out, how we respond to them, what it means, how they're deployed. And so much of the dyad that gets produced is a dyad that is about saving young girls, saving Muslim girls, right, from their brown and black men. This is a critique that has been waged for a long time by feminist scholars, and certainly it's not new, but we see it playing out profoundly with the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. And really it's the force of the victim to be saved narrative that is profoundly central. And when I say what gives the ICC its legitimacy when it doesn't enjoy the powers of a state, in part what I'm saying is that it is its ability to mobilize an emotional regime and embodied responses that give international justice its force. It's not just about technocratic legal domains in which the law enshrines certain provisions, which gives the law its force. In the international domain, that's only the beginning. In order to gain significant political support, scholars, we need to study and make sense of how this form of imagery, how the idea of the victim to be saved, how the notion of a perpetrator to be stopped, and a particular kind of perpetrator in an international justice, it's a brown and black perpetrator to be stopped, is the profound figure in international criminal justice. And it goes a long way in producing the terms on which international justice is forged. And so thanks for that question. I think it's really an important point, and it's part of the power of the law.
So we have a few more questions. The next one is from Teferi Adam, who greets you after a long time. And I think it's inviting you to think beyond the way that the reattribution, the affective reattribution mobilizes sort of a history of colonialism. What other examples, maybe you could share examples from recent conflicts where there is still a pushback to the ICC, even as some of the perhaps blame is assigned to a more contemporary condition. Does that make sense? So they say, I'm wondering if you could share examples from recent conflicts along ethnic lines, religion, livelihood, generations, where the concept of affective justice is maybe equally relevant. And so the way I'm interpreting that is things in the contemporary moment where perhaps both international law and pushback to the justice mobilized by it are working at a shorter time frame, but still perhaps in opposition to each other. And then the second one is by Mary Chapin. Given the case study of Kenya and how the ICC was shown to be ineffective in addressing structural violence that was integrated into the election or electoral violence, is there a place for an institution like the ICC, or would we need an entirely African court to be more effective in mitigating violence on the continent? And I'm going to do one more because the other one's about Kenya too. So in the example of Kenya, this is from Carrie Wa and Jogu. So in the example of Kenya, Uhuru and Ruto are portrayed as victims targeted by the ICC. Did you by any chance have a chance to interview displaced victims after the failure of the ICC? Do they have another avenue to obtain justice?
Okay, great. Thank you for those. I guess I'll start with with Chiari's question. Thanks for that. Yes, we certainly interviewed displaced victims or those victimized by violence as much as we interviewed, journalists and politicians and the Chief Justice and others. And really, I mean, in political terms, it's not an academic response to the question, but a deeply political one that's connected to my academic commitments, is that there are limits to the use of law here, and that law, and there are times when law can be mobilized. There are times when law is expressive and it affirms what is acceptable and what isn't. But like many critical theorists of law, I too would insist that these are political problems. If we think about displacement over 100 years, if we think about land reform, if we think about many of the institutional mechanisms that aren't functioning in the way that they should, the failure of the state or the post-colonial state, that these are about political decisions. These are about political solutions to age-old structural problems. And so, I mean, I'm not a ICC chair leader, but I'm intrigued by the interface between international justice and the call for law. One of the things that the ICC, one of the problems around the ICC is the concept of the individual criminal accountability or culpability. The idea that the ICC is interested in pursuing high-ranking leaders And the proximate actors, those everyday foot soldiers, the people who actually stole the goat or raped the child or did some of the quite horrific acts, whether it's in Kenya or Uganda or elsewhere. You know, people also want to see, they don't want to know that the state has failed them. They want to see what they understand as justice. And sometimes it's about rebuilding, simply rebuilding a home and sending their kids to school, and going through a ritual to find some resolution with those who actually committed the crime, that they could care less about whether or not Ruto or Uhuru are before the court. And so I think that the domain of the political is important here. The question about Mary Chapin's question about other mechanisms, in the second half of the book, the African court was another domain of inquiry for me. And what's fascinating about the emergence of the African court is that on one hand, it emerged as a political instrument. But what's ideologically interesting is that it introduced 14 crimes. Some of those crimes, 4 of them are crimes that are already enumerated under the international, under the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. But the other crimes, some of them they're transnational crimes. They're not elevated to the realm of the international, and they have to do with drug trafficking. They have to do with mercenaryism. They have to do with other economic crimes that actually produce the conditions in which political crimes happen, where genocide might happen, but that is enabled because of, you know, the cross-boundary sale of arms, illegal sale of arms, or a range of things, you know, toxic dumping, and other crimes that people see as significant. And so the emergence of an African court as an aspiration, it was a way to protest the International Criminal Court and justice far away in Europe, and to bring closer to home, and the ability to highlight those crimes that are actually of concern, economically and politically. I did a lot of work with the legal counsel at the African Union in relation to the African court, including some of the research for this. And so I'm actually quite intimately connected to the project, but I also recognize that it's an expressive project. It's for now, it's not going to be instrumentalized, and maybe it will never be. And perhaps there's a place for it, a role that such a mechanism can play, but not right now, for sure, for a number of reasons. But it does speak to the nature of protest, and that was what was of interest to me, the way that it exists as a protest treaty. And then the final question, beyond narratives of colonial roots. Yes, indeed. I mean, there's so many narratives that emerge. I gave one of them, calling up colonial roots and displacement, but certainly a range of other imbrications between ethnicity, language, indeed, you say generations, all of those components. One could, in most places in sub-Saharan Africa, you could think effectively about people's embodied engagements and the production of justice, and how something like ethnicity comes to represent certain relationships, and how those feelings about one's ethnic alliance could either embolden someone or make someone vulnerable. And certainly we see this playing out. The case in West Africa and Cote d'Ivoire is a good example of that. We see victor's justice playing out significantly in many parts of the continent. So the complexity is vast. And as I said, I talked about colonialism as a response, as one of the ways, one of the vectors, but there are many, many. So you're absolutely right to point that out.
Thank you. I, as usual, we never have enough time for all of the discussion that we could be having about your work. But I just wanted to make sure that I gave you the opportunity, that I had the opportunity to hear your response. to this question that I have, and that is basically that, you know, for a long time, I think you've been talking and writing about what I would call anti-racist and anti-colonial practices in anthropology, in the study of Africa, and then just more broadly within, you know, the so-called Western university. And so I'm just wondering how you're thinking about these questions now, and, you know, what sorts of practices do you identify as necessary? What, you know, what horizons of possibilities do you see? I'd love to hear your thoughts on in the last few minutes on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I could talk for an hour about that, but just in a nutshell then, thanks for that question. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot since I guess since last year with the publication of Ryan Jobson's piece on the case to let anthropology burn. Really, and it's a question mark because it's a question about how we can rebuild it. And in relation to knowledge production, nowhere is the call for decolonization of knowledge production more urgent than in academia, certainly in anthropology, but also in African studies. And so one of the projects that I've been spearheading with many other colleagues has had to do with the what we call toward a radically humanist anthropology, which at its core is really about how we rethink ethnographic knowledge. And one of the, you know, there are a number of tenets or principles that we've, in collaboration with Wenner Gren, are working on 5 core principles that are essential for thinking about a radically humanist anthropology. What would that mean? And I think the COVID-19 moment and the kind of police violence and white racist supremacy that we see in our landscapes, whether it's here or elsewhere, the kind of populism and invigoration around white supremacy in many ways makes it even more urgent to think about these things. So moving from Eurocentric perspectives, and by that we're not simply talking about racism in and of itself, but the seemingly benign concepts that come to constitute other worlds. So the presumed separation between nature and culture, or the presumed separation between the self and other, the presumptions about what theory building looks like. These dichotomies have structured research and teaching for a long time. And one of the areas that I think is certainly relevant in anthropology and in African studies is the call for thinking critically about regimes of extraction, knowledge extraction. So one of the persistent problems is that we see it, many anthropologists in the South are saying that there exists intellectual extractivism, and this is inherent in the fieldwork methods that we use, that ethnographers from the global North have long benefited from, the insights and social networks of members of the communities where they're conducting research. They write their books, they make their careers, and they rarely compensate those who have they have depended on for their research, let alone recognize them as original thinkers in their own right. And so part of the argument, and this is just one alongside some of the conceptual dichotomies, these are 1 or 2 areas for thinking about the decolonization of the work that we do. It's the insistence that, or at least asking and answering the question, what would more equitable practices of collaborative knowledge production look like? Is it simply a matter of thanking everyone in the beginning of a book for their engagement, or how else can we craft a more responsible, accountable set of practices around the knowledge that we build? And I think to end, because we've run out of time, and I think part of the answer has to do with interrogating what a grounded commitment to radical humanism might look like. What are the key principles? And some of them for us have to do with principles of equality, of connection. Of course, rethinking the conception of a stable, knowable, liberal subject in the field, getting rid of the distinction between humans and non-humans, and instead recognizing the ways that they're entangled. So there are a range of conceptual rethinkings that would be key to the decolonizing knowledge. And it's certainly an outgrowth of much of the last 20 years of the work that I've done, and really the need to be more accountable to the knowledge that we produce and that we teach and that we propagate through our teaching and writing practices.
I love that. I think that's a perfect way to end. And, I just want to underline that. Yeah, I love that. I love thinking really seriously about accountability. And I also appreciate, I'm a border scholar, so I really appreciate you kind of thinking that exploring the ways in which we need a little bit more porosity, right, between these like hard fixed modernist boundaries between self and other, between knowledge maker and site of knowledge extraction, and yeah, all of those things. So yeah, there's a lot there, and I'm excited to see what comes out of your work and the collective that you're working with in the future, and really hopeful about that. So I just want to thank you again for being here and sharing again what ends up just being such a small sliver of this really rich work. And yeah, I just really appreciate it, Kamari. I appreciate all of the people who asked questions, who attended, and we look forward to seeing you at future Council on African Studies and Anthropology events. So goodbye to everybody.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Leslie. Bye-bye now.
No problem. Take care.